The night they decided to end her, the village gathered with trembling hands and muttered prayers, believing that their combined fear and hatred could snuff out what they called a cursed presence. Torches flickered in the darkness, their flames wavering as if uncertain of the task at hand, casting shadows that danced like restless spirits on the walls of the huts. Some brought firewood, the kind that burned hot and fast, capable of reducing anything living, or thought to be living, to ash. Others carried bitter herbs and powders, their pungent smell drifting through the night air, thick and choking, meant to poison the body and soul alike. A circle was drawn in the dust, crude but solemn, intended to trap her in a ritual of endings. Every villager who had felt wronged, slighted, or fearful of her power stood around the perimeter, chanting words they barely remembered, their voices shaking under the weight of anticipation and dread. The wind held its breath. Even the trees seemed to bend away as though they too feared what was about to unfold. She had been taken unaware at first, dragged from the shadows of her own home and placed in the center of the circle, the firelight glaring against her face, revealing eyes wide with fear but still burning with defiance. She could hear every whispered threat, every muttered hope that she would be gone by morning. The scent of burning wood, mixed with the acrid tang of crushed herbs, filled her nostrils, making her gag, but she refused to close her eyes. She had learned that the first step to survival was to witness, to see, to record each motion of those who thought they had power over her. The air seemed to thicken around her, each breath a labor, each heartbeat echoing in her ears like the toll of some invisible bell. The villagers had believed that fear alone could weaken her, that their rituals were enough to snuff out her spirit, but they did not know the depth of what lay within her. The fire was lit, the flames licking at the air, curling toward her as though eager to claim her. Someone poured a bitter, dark liquid over her arms and legs, a potion made from crushed leaves, mud, and ashes from previous burnings. The smell made her gag, but she did not cry out. Instead, she focused on the small things, the tremor in the hand of the eldest man, the hesitation in the chant of a woman who had once claimed to fear nothing, the way shadows flickered unnaturally across the ground. They had thought to weaken her body, to frighten her soul, but they could not reach the core that remained untouched, the part that lived in defiance and in the quiet, unyielding knowledge that she would endure. They cast their words, their curses, their fire, expecting a reaction, expecting to see her spirit falter. But she remained still, breathing shallowly, each inhalation a testament to a resilience they could not measure. When they thought they had succeeded, when the fire reached its peak and the powders smoldered into nothing, she felt a strange calm. A warmth within her, unlike any fire or herb or chant, spread through her, shielding her, preserving her essence. The villagers stepped back, believing the ritual complete, believing the air around her had grown heavy because she was already gone. They whispered among themselves, afraid to speak too loudly, afraid that the very presence they thought destroyed would return to haunt them. Hours passed in tense silence. The fire burned low, the smoke curling toward the heavens, the circle left empty of action but full of fearful expectation. They left her there, thinking the night had claimed her spirit. The village exhaled as if relief could undo the terror they had endured, unaware that the air had shifted, that the earth itself held her presence, that the night carried her essence away from their grasp. And somewhere, deep in the remnants of flame and ash, her spirit lingered, untouched and alive, waiting for the moment when every step she took would become a warning to those who had dared to believe they could kill her. When dawn finally broke over the village, it was not a gentle light. It fell in shards, broken and trembling across the huts, and it caught her first as she stirred from the haze of the night. The fire had burned low, the remnants of herbs and ash scattered across the dirt, but she did not rise immediately. Her body felt different, as though the fire and the poison had only been tests and she had passed. Every limb, every breath, pulsed with a strange vitality, a sense of being both here and somewhere beyond. She opened her eyes and realized she could feel the air differently, each movement of the wind against her skin registering as a signal, a warning, a message. The morning birds sang, but she noticed more than their tune. She felt their agitation, the subtle shift in feathers, the tiny vibrations in the earth as they hopped and flitted. The village was waking, but she sensed it more as a tapestry of emotions and intentions rather than the familiar bustle of daily life. She was aware of everything in a way she had never been before. Slowly she rose, testing the strength in her limbs. They obeyed fully, yet with a new kind of awareness, as though she could sense the potential of each muscle, the trajectory of her movements before she made them. Her skin tingled, sensitive to the faintest touch of light, the soft brush of leaves, even the residual heat from the dying embers. She inhaled deeply, tasting the scents of the village, the smoke from last night's ritual, the wet earth, the herbs still lingering in the air, and realized she could detect more than just the physical. She could sense the fear, the whispers of guilt, the relief that her tormentors felt now that they believed she was gone. Every human presence seemed to carry a signature, a tremor of intent and thought, and she felt them all. It was overwhelming at first, yet intoxicating. She moved quietly through the remnants of the circle, her bare feet brushing against ash and dirt, noticing how each particle seemed to respond to her presence. It was as if the world had shifted subtly during the night, rearranging itself around the pulse of her spirit. She felt stronger, yes, but also more attuned. Her senses were sharper, her perception almost prophetic. She realized that surviving the attempt on her life had changed her fundamentally. The villagers thought they had ended her, but in truth, they had awakened something within her that had always lain dormant, a part of her spirit that observed, understood, and remembered far beyond the limitations of flesh. She stepped beyond the circle, out into the village proper. The houses looked the same, the familiar paths winding between them, but nothing felt ordinary. She could sense the residual fear in those who had gathered for the ritual, lingering like a fog that clung to corners and doorways. She could see intentions in the air, subtle shifts in posture and gaze, the hesitation of footsteps, the tiny betrayals of those who wished they had acted differently. Even the animals she passed seemed to sense her change. Dogs growled softly, birds flitted from branches in warning, and the wind itself seemed to bend around her, carrying whispers of caution. Her thoughts turned inward. The fire, the poison, the rituals, they had not ended her. They had instead unlocked a depth of awareness, a connection to the world that had been hidden beneath layers of normalcy. She felt the pulse of the earth beneath her, the rhythm of life around her, and understood that she had been given a second chance not merely to live, but to observe, to act, to influence. Her spirit was no longer just her own. It had expanded, grown, touched by the forces that had tried to destroy it and made stronger for it. As she walked through the village, every step carried new meaning. Every glance, every pause, every movement felt like a test of her newfound perception. She realized that she could no longer be treated as ordinary, that the world itself had shifted to accommodate the truth of her survival. The villagers had thought her gone, her spirit extinguished, but in reality she had awakened, changed forever, and every breath she took was now a testament to the power that had survived the night, a silent warning that her life, and her awareness, could not be undone. You said. When she stepped out of her hut for the first time since the night of fire and poison, the village seemed to hold its breath. Her bare feet sank into the dew-soaked earth, and the familiar crunch of leaves beneath them carried an unfamiliar weight. Something had changed in the air. The mist that clung to the ground curled around her ankles, moving like a living thing, sensitive to her presence. Even before she had fully crossed the threshold of her home, she sensed it, the subtle shifting of the world in response to her survival. A pot on a nearby windowsill quivered and teetered, then fell with a soft crash, startling a passing child who ran screaming into his mother's arms. The incident was small, almost insignificant, but to her, it was the first sign that her existence no longer blended with the ordinary. Birds took flight with a sudden, sharp flutter, scattering from trees she had passed countless times without notice. Their wings beat a frantic rhythm in the sky, and she realized she could feel the tremor of their hearts as they lifted, a resonance that pulsed through her own chest. Even the stray dogs who had once ignored her completely, recoiled as she walked past, their hackles rising, teeth bared in low growls. The village cats slunk into shadows that were far too deep for natural hiding, their eyes wide and glowing, tracking her every move. Every animal, every living thing, reacted as if sensing a force she could barely define but understood instinctively. She could feel it stirring around her, a silent acknowledgement of the change she carried within her, an energy that both attracted and repelled. The villagers themselves felt it before they understood why. Doors creaked open on their own, shutters rattled against the wind, and a subtle shiver of unease ran through those who had once participated in the attempt to destroy her. Mothers clutched children to their chests, men stiffened mid-step, and whispers rose and fell like a wave against stone walls. She could see it in their eyes, the flash of recognition, the flicker of guilt, the instinctive fear that something alive yet unseen was present. Even those who had been her allies or indifferent, felt the pull of her spirit, as if it brushed against the corners of their minds, tugging at their consciousness. Her first step outside had sent a ripple through the village, and the effects were subtle, slow, but impossible to ignore. Objects moved in the periphery of her vision. A clay pot rolled slowly across the yard, stopping just shy of a fence post, as though it had been guided by an invisible hand. A broom leaned against a wall, toppled over with a soft thud. Windows that had been closed creaked and swung open, catching the wind in ways that seemed almost deliberate. She walked with a careful attention to her surroundings, realizing that these disturbances were not random but reactions, warnings. The village itself was speaking to her, or perhaps she was finally attuned to the silent language of the world she had never perceived before. Every fallen leaf, every shaking branch, every startled animal was a note in a song she could now hear, an orchestration of subtle caution that marked her first steps as dangerous and significant. Even the air seemed heavier, charged with an awareness she had not known existed. She sensed the weight of the villagers' gazes as she passed, even when their bodies remained still. Their thoughts, their fears, their unspoken guilt radiated like faint tremors, brushing against her skin and setting the hair on her arms on end. It was not merely observation, it was instinct, amplified by her survival and the awakening she had undergone. The world itself was alert to her presence, reacting to her in ways that made her feel simultaneously alive and profoundly feared. By the time she reached the edge of the village square, it was clear that nothing would remain ordinary again. Pots, animals, even the swaying branches above, all had borne witness to her first step outside. And the villagers, though they tried to act normally, could not hide the shiver that ran through them. She realized, with a mixture of satisfaction and caution, that her survival was no longer a private miracle. It had become a living warning. Every glance, every movement, every step she took now carried a message that could not be ignored. She was not broken, she was not weak, and the world would feel the echo of her spirit long before it saw her form. Her presence did not announce itself with fanfare or violence. It moved quietly through the village, a subtle hum of awareness that grew heavier with each step she took. Those who had tried to destroy her spirit felt it first in the back of their minds, like a whisper brushing against the edges of thought. At night, they awoke with hearts pounding, drenched in sweat, as if the shadows themselves were pressing down on their chests. Dreams turned dark, twisted into vivid nightmares where faces they knew morphed into masks of horror, echoing the fear they had once inflicted upon her. One man dreamed of hands reaching from the soil, pulling him down, dragging him into darkness. A woman saw herself trapped in a circle of fire, the flames licking at her skin, no escape, no aid, no hope. And every morning, each awoke to find signs that the night had not been a dream alone. Ashes scattered in corners where no fire had burned, footprints in the soil that did not match any human form. By day the effect continued. Objects shifted subtly when no one watched. Pots leaning impossibly, doors creaking open or closed on their own, a flicker of shadow darting across walls. Birds shrieked overhead, taking flight in erratic patterns, and even the livestock seemed skittish, restless, unaccountably uneasy. The villagers whispered among themselves, exchanging glances loaded with tension, each encounter carrying an unspoken question. Had she returned? Was she here? And when one dared to speak her name aloud, the air grew thick, like the weight of the world pressing in, and the words stuck in their throats. Even the most hardened skeptics felt a creeping paranoia, a creeping dread that something unseen was walking among them, watching, judging, remembering every cruelty, every attempt to harm her. It was not vengeance in the conventional sense. No fire leapt from her hands, no curses were flung aloud. Yet her mere existence became an instrument of reckoning. Whispers in the village carried her presence, like a fog that seeped through walls, carrying a tension impossible to escape. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, complaining of strange shadows at the edges of their vision, of voices that mimicked their own in empty rooms. Elders murmured prayers under their breaths, shaking at sounds that seemed too deliberate to be coincidental. Even the wind seemed to carry her essence, shifting leaves into shapes that suggested warnings, rustling through the village with a sense of purpose. Each of her movements, each deliberate step she took, amplified the unease that had already begun to settle in the hearts of those who had harmed her. At times, the guilty sought to flee, hoping distance would sever the connection they felt but could not see. They ran to the farthest corners of the village, only to find the unease followed them, no matter how fast they moved. Floors creaked beneath their feet as if alert to every footfall, shadows loomed longer than they should have, and even the night seemed too silent, too watchful. The whispers of fear carried in the wind became their companions, reminding them with every glance, every twitch, every unexpected sound that she was no longer just a human among them. She was a presence, a warning, a living echo of what they had tried to destroy. The village itself seemed to tremble under her influence. Doors rattled in the absence of wind, animals refused to enter certain yards, and windows shook as though something unseen was testing the limits of its reach. Fear became contagious, spreading faster than fire, an invisible web spun through their minds, binding them to her survival. And in the stillness of night, when the world held its breath, the guilty whispered her name in dread, certain that even without sight, without touch, her spirit watched, listened, and remembered. The echo of her fearlessness and endurance had transformed into a force that no lie, no escape, and no denial could erase, a silent reckoning haunting the lives of those who had thought themselves free of consequence. With each step she took, the earth beneath her seemed to remember, as though the ground itself had been waiting for her return. Her feet pressed lightly against the soil, yet something invisible followed in her wake, leaving a trail that carried her presence like a stain no one could wash away. The dew-slick grass trembled briefly where she passed, and shadows stretched unnaturally, lingering long after she had moved on. Even the light of the sun, spilling over the village rooftops, bent subtly around her, creating angles and darkness that felt too deliberate to be natural. She did not need to look behind her to know that something followed, something tied to her survival, her spirit, her defiance. Those who dared to cross her path noticed it first in small ways, a chill that brushed their necks, a shadow where none should have been, a faint whisper carried on the wind that made them shiver with unease. Children were the first to sense it fully. They ran past her without knowing why their feet stumbled, why the air felt heavy, why the leaves seemed to shiver with anticipation. A young boy, chasing a rolling clay ball, froze mid-step when the shadow stretched across his path, a darkness that clung to the earth and pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat out of sync with his own. He stumbled backward, eyes wide, and whispered to his mother about a trail of night that followed her. The woman shushed him quickly, afraid of speaking the truth, but the fear had already rooted itself deep. Others began to notice strange traces along the roads and paths she had walked the previous night. Footprints appeared in mud that could not hold them, depressions in the dust that remained even when wind swept across the village, and fleeting shadows that seemed to detach from their origin, moving in directions no light could cast. The adults felt it differently, a gnawing tension in the bones. Men who had once mocked her now avoided the streets where she had passed, convinced that an unseen presence lingered, following, observing, judging. Windows rattled when she neared, doors seemed to shift slightly in their frames, and animals skittered away from paths she had taken hours before. Even those who did not believe in spirits found themselves pausing mid-step, hearts hammering, hair standing on end, as though some imperceptible hand traced along their backs. There was no mistaking it. Wherever she went she left a mark, a warning, an imprint that carried the weight of her survival and the echo of those who had tried to destroy her. It was not malicious, not in the conventional sense, yet it was undeniable. Anyone who crossed her trail felt an instinctive disquiet, an awareness that they had entered territory they were not meant to tread. A baker sweeping his shop floor stopped abruptly when a dark smear stretched across the room, moving against the grain of the dust. A woman tending to her garden dropped her trowel as a shadow flickered over the soil, and she heard faint whispers in a voice she could not place, echoes of warning she did not yet understand. The shadow trail moved like liquid, pooling in corners, slipping along walls and lingering over paths long after her form had vanished from sight. She herself noticed it least of all. Walking was effortless, natural, and yet she felt a subtle pull beneath her feet, a response from the world that acknowledged her presence. She could sense the marks she left behind, not as burden but as proof that she had endured, that she existed beyond fear, that her survival was not just physical but spiritual, woven into the very fabric of the village. The trail was a message written in absence, a warning encoded in shadow and silence, and everyone who crossed it even inadvertently felt the gravity of what it carried. By sunset, the village had begun to murmur about her, about the strange disturbances, the tremors of darkness that clung to streets and fields. She had walked past the river, through the square, along the forest edge, and each step had left a supernatural imprint that unsettled the most skeptical minds. Doors were left half open, windows creaked in the windless night, and animals refused to cross certain paths. Every trace she left was a reminder that she was no longer just a person moving through the village. She was a force, a presence, a shadow that carried consequence. And as night fell, those who dared to step where she had walked could feel it. The warning had been made and the world had already begun to err. She sat quietly in the shadowed corner of her home, the moonlight spilling across the floorboards, and for the first time allowed herself to reflect. The nights of terror, the rituals, the attempts to break her body and spirit, all of it replayed in her mind like a series of flickering images. But amidst the memory of flames and bitter herbs, she realized something profound. The reason she had survived was never simply luck or chance. It was a heritage, a lineage of women who had carried strength and endurance in their blood, who had faced forces unseen and emerged unbroken. Her grandmother's voice, soft and steady, drifted into her memory, reminding her of lessons whispered in childhood. "We are born with a fire, my child, one they cannot touch. They may try, but it will not bend, it will not die." She remembered the stories her grandmother told late at night, tales of ancestors who had survived plague, famine, betrayal, and curses. Each woman had faced trials that should have ended them, yet their spirits persisted. They were called witches, healers, and sometimes mad women, yet their strength was undeniable. Her own mother had been strong too, though quieter, with a resilience that ran deeper than the surface of her calm demeanor. That strength had been passed down to her, encoded in the very marrow of her bones, so that even in the darkest, most desperate moments, she could summon it without conscious thought. It was a power that lived in her blood, a hidden inheritance that made her untouchable in ways her attackers could never understand. But lineage alone was not enough. She recalled the fear she had felt as the flames licked closer, the herbs burned, and the chants pressed against her mind. In those moments, the inner strength that defined her surged with a force that surprised even herself. It was not the strength of muscles or even of will alone. It was a combination of awareness, courage, and the refusal to be diminished. Each heartbeat became a drum of defiance, each breath a declaration that she would not succumb. That strength, forged through fear and sharpened by suffering, had acted as armor, allowing her to endure the attempts on her life and rise anew. There was also the hidden blessing, the gift her grandmother had quietly passed down without explanation. It had seemed like a small charm at first, a pendant tucked into the folds of her clothing, warm against her chest in moments of danger. She now understood it had always been more than a charm. It was a conduit for the protective energy that ran through her family line, a beacon for survival and a shield against forces that sought to undo her. During the ritual, when the fire and herbs threatened to overwhelm her, the pendant glowed faintly against her skin, a pulse of warmth that anchored her spirit to life, whispering in its own silent language that she could not be extinguished. The blessing had been dormant, subtle, but in the moment of crisis it had awakened fully, lending her the strength that no human or spirit could dismantle. As she reflected on all of this, she felt a quiet confidence settle over her. She was no longer merely a survivor, she was a culmination of generations of endurance, a vessel of hidden power that could withstand even the most calculated attempts to erase her. She understood now that her spirit was unkillable because it was rooted in blood, honed by inner resilience, and guided by the blessing her ancestors had bestowed. It was a combination of factors that her enemies could never hope to comprehend, much less control. The realization brought with it clarity. She was not fragile. She was not at the mercy of fear. Every trial she had endured, every attempt to break her, had revealed the depth of her own power. She rose, feeling the pulse of life in her veins, the warmth of the hidden blessing against her chest, and the certainty that whatever came next she could face it, not because she was invincible in the conventional sense, but because she was alive in every sense that truly mattered, blood, spirit, and soul aligned, a force that no fire, no poison, no ritual could extinguish. She walked into the village square with a quiet authority that made the air itself shift. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the ground, and every face she passed turned, some with curiosity, others with instinctive fear. Those who had attempted to destroy her, men and women who had carried fire, herbs, and chants with the intent to end her, recognized her immediately. Their eyes widened, and their steps faltered as if the ground beneath them had become treacherous. She did not speak, did not raise her hands in threat, yet the weight of her presence made them recoil. There was an unnatural stillness around her, a subtle tension that thickened the air, making it difficult to breathe normally. Even the trees along the edges of the square seemed to lean back, their leaves trembling, as though nature itself acknowledged that justice, or something like it, had arrived. Her gaze swept across the guilty, and each one felt it like a physical touch. It was impossible to ignore. The baker who had whispered curses over her head now could not hold a ladle without dropping it, his fingers trembling uncontrollably. A woman who had poured bitter herbs into the fire recoiled, her mouth dry, her voice caught in her throat when she tried to speak. Even those who had not directly harmed her but had stood silently, complicit, shifted uneasily. The ground beneath their feet seemed to hum with energy, a subtle vibration that raised goosebumps and sent shivers down spines. Each heartbeat of theirs echoed unnaturally, as if her spirit were marking the rhythm, aligning it with its own pulse, and forcing them to feel the weight of their guilt in a way that no human could endure without notice. Small, almost imperceptible signs began to appear around them. A shadow stretched toward the sky and twisted unnaturally, elongating until it resembled the twisted forms of their own fearful imaginations. Leaves and dust swirled in a circle around them, rising without wind, and for a moment the village square felt like a space outside of time, a crucible designed to show them the consequences of their actions. Birds screeched overhead, flapping in chaotic patterns, and even the animals in the market froze, their eyes wide, sensing something beyond the ordinary. The guilty could not escape it. Every glance they dared to give her revealed not just her form but a faint, flickering presence behind her, a shadow of herself that carried all the fire, all the survival, and all the warning of her spirit. She approached the first man who had led the ritual, the one who had held the firewood, and shouted the words meant to condemn her. He stepped back instinctively, tripping over a stone, and when he looked up, the shadow behind her seemed to bend, leaning toward him, growing in size, coiling like smoke with intent. He dropped to his knees, gasping as if the weight of all the nights of fear, hatred, and cruelty had pressed down upon him at once. Other villagers who had participated or condoned the attempt mirrored his reaction, hearts pounding, hands shaking, every nerve alight with a tension they could not control. The air itself carried whispers of accusation, faint murmurs echoing the crimes they had committed, each syllable inescapable, undeniable. She did not speak. Her eyes alone were enough. In them burned the memory of the flames, the herbs, the chants, and the silence of the world that had watched while they tried to erase her. And yet, there was no malice in her gaze, only a recognition of the truth. They had acted out of fear and ignorance, and now, for the first time, they were forced to face that reckoning. One by one they understood it, each in their own way. Some began to cry quietly, others fell silent in stunned terror, and a few attempted to flee, only to find their paths hindered by shadows that seemed to twist before them, guiding them back to the square where her presence anchored them. By the time the sun had dipped further toward the horizon, the confrontation had reached its full weight. The guilty could no longer deny the power of her survival, the supernatural force that had accompanied her, or the undeniable truth that their actions carried consequences. The air hung heavy, charged with the memory of what had been attempted and the proof that nothing, not fire, poison, or ritual, could erase what lived within her. Her spirit had arrived to witness, to mark, and to remind them, and in that tense silence, they knew with clarity that survival was not just a right but a warning, and that every attempt to destroy it had only strengthened the force they had sought to vanquish. The air in the village thickened as dusk settled, carrying with it a weight that was neither wind nor storm. She emerged from the shadows of the forest path, her form initially familiar, human in shape, yet the energy that radiated from her made every step she took tremble with a strange resonance. The villagers paused, their chores forgotten, their conversations dying mid-word, all eyes drawn irresistibly toward her. At first, she was only herself, walking quietly, but gradually the edges of her form began to shift. Her body flickered, a subtle distortion that caught in peripheral vision, and a pale glow traced the outlines of her limbs. The firelight from the evening torches reflected differently off her skin, as if bending unnaturally, casting elongated shadows that did not conform to the laws of light. The villagers noticed it first in whispers, a soft, collective murmur, a rising unease that something entirely impossible was taking shape before them. She stopped in the center of the square, her eyes scanning the gathered crowd, and the change became undeniable. Her hair lifted slightly as if a breeze no one felt carried it, and the glow intensified, outlining her silhouette in hues that no natural light could create. The shadow behind her lengthened, twisting into shapes that resembled creatures they could not name, figures that moved in the spaces between reality and dream. Her lips parted, and though she spoke no words, the air vibrated with sound, carrying her essence in ways the villagers could perceive without hearing. Some felt a pressure in their chests, a tightening that mirrored fear and awe simultaneously. Others saw shapes in their peripheral vision that vanished the instant they tried to focus, but the impression lingered, a subtle insistence that this was no ordinary human standing among them. The supernatural aspect of her manifestation was not violent, yet it held authority that could not be denied. Flames from nearby torches bent toward her as if drawn by an invisible force, licking at her spectral edges without scorching her. The shadows under the eaves of houses moved against the light's natural angle, stretching unnaturally to acknowledge her presence. Even the wind seemed to carry her essence, stirring leaves and dust into spirals that encircled her form, emphasizing the unnatural gravity she now possessed. The villagers felt a hum in the ground, a resonance that pulsed beneath their feet, synchronized with the rhythm of her spirit, subtle yet unavoidable. Panic rose in some, fascination in others, and disbelief in the most skeptical, Yet no one could avert their gaze. Every eye was locked on the impossible truth of her existence. She raised her arms slowly, deliberately, and the glow around her intensified, revealing the extent of the force they had underestimated. Her shadow, now clearly separate from her body, moved with a life of its own, undulating and stretching, forming shapes that seemed to point at each guilty soul, marking them as aware witnesses to her survival. The air around her shimmered with heatless energy, and a faint, unplaceable scent drifted through the square, earthy yet electric, like ozone before a storm, stirring instincts long buried in the villagers' minds. It was impossible to ignore. Even those who had tried to convince themselves of rational explanations felt the undeniable pressure of something beyond human comprehension pressing against their senses. A soft, echoing vibration ran through the ground, a subtle drumbeat that seemed to originate from her very being. The guilty shifted nervously, glancing at one another, sensing that the presence standing before them carried memory, judgment, and a silent command. Her manifestation was both warning and proof. She had endured, she had transcended, and the supernatural force they had inadvertently nurtured by attempting to destroy her had now become visible, undeniable, and commanding. Some villagers fell to their knees, not in prayer but in instinctive recognition of the power that had always been present, waiting for acknowledgement. Others took hesitant steps back, trying to retreat from the reality they could no longer deny. Every flicker of shadow, every curve of spectral light, carried meaning, messages of survival, endurance, and warning. She did not need to speak. Her form, her essence, and the presence trailing her conveyed everything. Those who harmed her had underestimated what they sought to erase, and now, all could see that her spirit was alive, unyielding, and undeniable. By the time the moon rose fully into the sky, her manifestation had become the central truth of the village. The crowd, paralyzed between awe and fear, understood with an unspoken clarity that the attempts on her life had failed utterly. Her spectral presence lingered, a warning etched into the air, visible, tangible, and unforgettable, ensuring that every soul present would carry the memory of her survival and the power she now radiated, a living testament to the fact that some forces cannot be destroyed, only witnessed and respected. By the time she had withdrawn slightly from the center of the square, the village had shifted, the air heavy with a tension that was both fear and awe. The villagers moved cautiously, their movements measured, as though each step might provoke a reaction from the force they could now see was more than human. The realization spread slowly at first, a creeping awareness that what they had attempted, burning her, poisoning her, invoking rituals to erase her, had not only failed but awakened something far beyond their comprehension. Eyes that had once been indifferent now glimmered with terror and respect. Mothers clutched their children closer, whispering warnings that were half fear, half instruction, and even the youngest could sense the shift in the air, the weight of presence that now dominated the village square. The guilty felt it most keenly. Men and women who had wielded firewood, poured bitter herbs, or chanted the incantations that were meant to destroy her now stood frozen. The shadows that followed her trailed closer, lingering near them, elongating and twisting in ways that defied reason, as if the village itself had become an extension of her will. Every heartbeat they took seemed magnified, each breath heavier than the last. Whispers of conscience and dread tangled with the murmurs of those who had remained silent, innocent or complicit, creating an atmosphere where every thought carried weight and every glance revealed guilt. They had seen her survive the impossible, and now they understood in a visceral, undeniable way that their actions had consequences beyond the mortal realm. The villagers' animals mirrored the tension in ways that could not be ignored. Dogs cowered, ears flattened, refusing to enter certain streets she had crossed. Birds, previously indifferent, flitted erratically across rooftops, their calls piercing and urgent, signaling the invisible presence lingering in the air. Even the wind seemed to twist unnaturally, carrying a low hum, a vibration that resonated in bones and hearts alike. It was as though the entire environment had acknowledged her survival, amplifying the subtle warnings she had already left in her footsteps. The village itself had become a testament to her endurance and a messenger of respect and caution. As the understanding took hold, whispers began circulating. "She cannot be harmed," one villager said, voice trembling. "We were fools to try," another admitted, eyes wide and fixed on her form. The realization was unanimous. This was no longer a human among them, or at least no longer just a human in any ordinary sense. Her presence had become an extension of her survival, a living embodiment of the consequences of cruelty and ignorance. Even those who had never lifted a hand against her felt the weight of the warning. Fear seeped into the corners of every mind, mingling with the respect that naturally follows recognition of power that cannot be denied. The village began to adjust, subtly at first, instinctively, in response to the knowledge she imparted without words. Paths she had walked were treated with caution, gestures of reverence became common, and the space she occupied was given silent acknowledgement. Children no longer ran through certain streets, elders paused to reflect in her presence, and even markets shifted slightly, as if the rhythm of daily life had been nudged by an unseen force. Every action became colored by the understanding that her spirit, once threatened, now held dominion over the consequences of harm. By nightfall the change was unmistakable. Conversations were softer, eyes lingered respectfully on the shadows she left behind, and no one dared to speak of fear without acknowledgement of the power she represented. The villagers comprehended fully that her survival was not merely physical but spiritual, a living, breathing testament to resilience that demanded recognition. The consequences of harming her had become undeniable, etched into the very atmosphere of the village. Fear and respect were now inseparable, a duality that hovered over every person, every home, and every path she might cross. In the quiet that followed, the village understood with certainty that the spirit they had tried to destroy was beyond their reach, and every step she took, every subtle mark she left behind, served as both warning and revelation, ensuring that her endurance would be honored, remembered, and feared for generations to come. She left the village at dawn, moving silently through the mist that clung to the trees and blanketed the narrow paths leading away from the homes that had once sought to end her. Her form was human in appearance, but the energy that radiated from her steps left traces behind, subtle yet indelible. Every stone she passed seemed to hum faintly with memory, every leaf whispered as she brushed past, and even the wind carried a residue of her presence. The villagers did not yet see her as she vanished into the distance, but they could feel her absence, heavy and undeniable, like the lingering echo of a bell whose sound refuses to fade. Each path she had walked became a corridor of memory, a reminder of what they had attempted and what they had failed to achieve. The children first noticed it in small ways. Footprints remained where no soil could hold them, shadows flickered unnaturally, and tiny inexplicable movements in the trees and grass seemed to respond to memories of her. They spoke of it in hushed tones, awe and fear mingling in their voices, sensing that the woman who had walked among them now existed beyond ordinary measure. Even when they tried to dismiss it as imagination, the signs persisted. The grass bent as though shaped by invisible hands, the air carried faint pulses of energy, and every object she had once touched seemed imbued with a subtle life of its own. It was as if the village itself had been transformed by her survival, leaving behind an indelible mark that could not be erased. The adults felt it differently, a slow and creeping awareness that the woman they had attempted to destroy had become a force that transcended fear. A pot left in a yard trembled when touched by the lightest breeze, a door swung slightly with no wind, and shadows moved in manners that defied the logic of sunlight and torchlight. Conversations hushed when her name was spoken, and even the skeptics, the most practical minds among them, felt a prickle of unease. They understood in their bones that her existence, her endurance, and the supernatural traces she left behind were lessons writ large upon the village. Cruelty and defiance toward her spirit carried consequences beyond what any of them had imagined. Her presence, though now distant, had become a symbol. Stories of her survival and the subtle yet undeniable power she wielded spread from household to household. Mothers recounted her endurance to children, emphasizing the lesson that no force could erase the courage and resilience of a spirit aligned with its own truth. Elders whispered to one another of the warnings etched invisibly into the landscape, reminding each other that power, once awakened, cannot be ignored or suppressed. Even those who had lived complicit or indifferent remembered the tension that had gripped the square when she confronted them, the shadows and whispers that revealed guilt and the cost of malice. In every heart, her story remained alive, a living warning etched in memory and perception. As seasons changed, her footsteps and the traces of her passage continued to influence the village. Paths she had crossed were treated with reverence, avoided when possible, or walked with careful respect. Trees and stones she had touched were tended differently, as if the village instinctively acknowledged the power they had been brushed by. The fields seemed to thrive under the weight of her memory, the air carrying a subtle clarity whenever the wind moved along her old paths. Her survival, her resilience, had become inseparable from the identity of the village itself, transforming fear into respect, terror into vigilance, and memory into a moral framework that endured far longer than her physical presence. Years later, even as she moved beyond sight, her spirit remained a living lesson. Parents spoke of the cost of defiance, Children learned that respect for unseen forces was not merely superstition, and the collective memory of her endurance shaped the behavior and consciousness of generations. Her steps had left not just shadows on the earth, but a permanent imprint on the village's psyche, a guide for understanding the weight of action, the consequences of cruelty, and the extraordinary power that arises from surviving what should have destroyed one utterly. And so, long after her form had vanished into the forests and fields beyond, the village remembered. They remembered the fear she inspired, the subtle, supernatural lessons she left behind, and the truth that some spirits, once awakened, carry a warning that endures beyond the reach of time, shaping every life that dares to cross the path she once walked. Every step she took, every shadow she left, every whisper of energy became a symbol of her power, and a lesson for all who remained. The cost of attempting to destroy what cannot be broken is written not in the past, but in the living memory of those who survived her presence. She moved away from the village at dawn, the sky painted with pale hues of orange and gold, yet the air seemed heavier where she had walked, charged with an energy that refused to dissipate. Each step left an invisible trail, subtle yet undeniable, lingering in the soil, clinging to the grass, twisting the shadows in ways no one could explain. The villagers did not see her departing, but they felt it. An unseen weight pressed upon them, a quiet insistence that the woman they had tried to destroy had survived, and that survival carried meaning far beyond their comprehension. It was a presence, a mark, a lesson, one that would not fade simply because she had walked beyond their sight. Children noticed first. Footprints appeared in places where no foot could have stepped, a dusting of soil shifted in patterns that could not be explained by wind or animals, and shadows moved with intent, separate from any light source. Whispers traveled between the young ones, tales of glimpses of her form in the morning mist or of shapes flickering at the edge of vision. They spoke in reverent fear, the stories growing in the telling, each recounting reinforcing the image of a force that was more than human. These small but persistent signs left a deep impression, teaching the children instinctively that some presences demanded respect, and that the world carried consequences far beyond what they could see or touch. The adults experienced it differently, a creeping realization that even her absence carried weight. Doors creaked without wind, objects shifted slightly as though moved by invisible hands, and shadows twisted unnaturally across walls and streets. Those who had harmed her felt it keenly, an unease that gnawed at their minds, a sense that every step they had taken against her had left a mark they could never erase. Even the most skeptical began to sense a change in the village itself, an intangible awareness that her passage had left the air thick with memory and warning. Conversations fell silent when her name was mentioned, eyes lingered on corners and shadows with hesitation, and the rhythm of daily life subtly shifted to accommodate an invisible authority that demanded recognition. Her survival had become a symbol, one that transcended ordinary understanding. Parents spoke of her endurance to children not as myth but as a truth born of experience and supernatural witness. Elders whispered reminders to one another, acknowledging the lessons etched into the village by her presence. Every field, street, and doorway she had passed became a subtle testament, a marker for behavior, vigilance, and respect. Even those who had once been complicit or indifferent could not deny it. The woman they had tried to destroy had changed the fabric of their reality, and in doing so, had established a legacy that would outlast her physical presence. The landscape of the village seemed altered by her passage. Paths she had walked were treated with reverence or avoided entirely, animals instinctively kept their distance, and the air itself seemed to hum faintly along the routes she had taken. Leaves rustled as if carrying whispers of her steps, the wind shifted in patterns that mimicked the rhythm of her movements, and the soil retained a quiet memory of her weight, a subtle reminder that no cruelty or defiance against her spirit had gone unnoticed. Her steps became lessons written into the world itself, tangible only in their effects, yet impossible to ignore for anyone who lived there. As years passed, the lessons endured. Stories of her defiance and the consequences of attempting to harm her spread across generations, teaching caution, respect, and awareness. Even after she had disappeared into the forests beyond the village, her shadow lingered in memory, and the cost of defiance became a moral compass, silently guiding behavior. Fear and reverence blended into a collective consciousness, ensuring that her presence, though unseen, shaped the village's identity. In the end, the villagers understood what could not be unlearned. Her spirit had become a symbol, her steps a living warning, and her survival an eternal testament to resilience. Even after she moved on, her legacy remained, etched into the earth, the air, the shadows, and the hearts of those who had witnessed her power. Every step she had taken carried a lesson, and every lesson endured, a reminder that the cost of attempting to destroy what cannot be broken is never forgotten and is never without consequence.